In early 3014, the Duke of Procyon, Anton Marik, left his palatial headquarters on New Delos within the Free Worlds League. He arrived at the Kashmir Arcology on Earth for an historic peace summit on January 15th. There, he came face to face with the Chancellor of the Capellan Confederation, Maximilian Liao. For the past 150 years, their two nations had been locked in an endless conflict. But over the next 2 days, and with diplomatic assistance from ComStar's first circuit, these great leaders, lords over countless billions, reached an accord that would end the Third Succession War between them for good. News of this agreement was met with thunderous acclaim. Upon his return home, the Duke was welcomed with a fanfare seldom seen anywhere in the Inner Sphere. Anton had achieved a degree of support unmatched by any other Marik for generations. Within the Free Worlds League Parliament, reaction to peace along their Spinwood border was similarly triumphant. The national mood wasn't completely anti-war, despite centuries of depredations. Many saw this as an opportunity to refocus their efforts against the true enemy, House Steiner of the Lyran Commonwealth. That was certainly the angle pushed by the Duke of Procyon himself. By this time, many MPs had become disenchanted with Captain General Janos Marik, Anton's older brother. Those ministers questioned why it was that it had fallen to the younger sibling to rescue the realm from their eternal struggle. The once greatly respected successor lord had fallen out of favour. Personal tragedies in his life had led to the elder statesman withdrawing into seclusion. Some began to whisper that it was in the national interest for him to step aside in favour of the more popular choice. Very few were aware of the true scale of the conspiracy now in play. 12 years earlier, Janos had charged his brother with subjugating their ancient foe, House Liao, but for 11 of those years, he had in fact been plotting with the enemy to overthrow his sibling. Anton had never forgiven him for having his childhood friend Willis Crawford executed for a failing he was not wholly responsible for in order to appease the realm's fickle politicians. The Captain General's willingness to kowtow to parliamentary rivals had alienated what was once his most ardent supporter, and the younger Marik had come to regard his liege lord as a weak and impotent ruler. For the betterment of the Free Worlds League, Janos would have to be deposed. Anton Marik's betrayal would of course play perfectly into Maximilian Liao's own ambitions to break apart one of his realm's most hated adversaries, a goal he had been clandestinely working towards for the past decade. Their secret conference on Terra had been facilitated by their mutual acquaintance, Vesser Christopher, close advisor to the Duke of Procyon, whose duties often had him acting as a go-between for the two schemers. One other individual was in attendance on that day. Traveling with the Capellan dignitary was Colonel Jamie Wolfe, leader of the Inner Sphere's most powerful mercenary group, Wolfe's Dragoons. He had spent the past 4 years fighting the Free Worlds League military, knew their weaknesses and how to exploit them. At Vesser's suggestion, the Chancellor had agreed to commit them to the cause for the final year of their contract with the Confederation. Once the conspirators had reached an agreement, they returned home to make final preparations. In late February, Wolfe's Dragoons left their berths within the Capellan Confederation and assembled at Campertown the following month. Then, in April, they crossed the border. Word of their passage through the Harzefeld system was suppressed thanks to a complicit ComStar. Christopher had his own motives for wanting to drag the mercenaries into the conflict. No one else present at Kashmir suspected that they were mere pawns in a game being played well above their heads. Neither noble was aware that the man they thought they knew was actually the Presenter Rom of ComStar, chief of that technocratic cult's shadowy intelligence agency. Since taking office in 3005, he had been fomenting rebellion as a means of crippling the Freewells League economy, and planned to ensure that Wolf's Dragoons sustained enough damage in the fighting that they would have to return to whatever hidden redoubt in the deep periphery they had spawned from, at last revealing their mysterious origins. Both of these Fesser did in the name of his primus, Julian Tiepolo, but privately, Christopher hoped that success would propel him to overall command of the Sacred Order. On May 22nd, 3014, from his capital on New Delos, Anton Marik made a most fateful pronouncement. The Duke of Procyon's speech would send shockwaves across the Freewells League and the wider Inner Sphere. In it, he compared himself to another who had held that position centuries past, Oliver Marik, a man forced to make a difficult but necessary decision on behalf of his people. The not-so-subtle allusion was that his brother Janosch was analogous to the mad Elise who had caused the Marik Civil War 300 years ago. A day later, Maximilian Liao issued his own statement in support, extolling the virtues of his ally, while simultaneously making it clear that a continued peace between their realms was dependent on the younger siblings' assumption of power. To that end, the rebel duke demanded that Janosch abdicate immediately, and declared himself the true Captain General of the Freewells League. Anton's revolt had begun. Before going any further in our coverage of this period in history, it's important to make certain things clear. To avoid any confusion, we'll use specific terms to refer to the two factions that emerged in the coming conflict. Anton claimed the position of Captain General himself, and thus believed he had outright dominion over the entirety of the Freewells League. He was not looking to create a breakaway state, nor redistrict the existing provinces. From his perspective, any who opposed him were in rebellion themselves. But going forwards, rebels and loyalists will refer to the supporters of Anton and Janosch respectively. Likewise, we'll continue to give Anton the title of Duke of Procyon, and reserve Captain General solely for Janosch. The outcome of the Civil War would not be decided solely by whichever side could win victory on the field of battle. The participants would need to achieve the same success in the realm of politics as well. For that reason, we'll take a moment to review the makeup of the Freewells League in 3014. At the onset of the rebellion, there were well over 100 provinces. The vast majority contain no more than 2 systems, sometimes even just a single continent. For the purposes of our history, most of those are irrelevant. Fewer than 20 were significant enough to control even 1% of Parliament's 500 seats, but almost 40% of those were managed by just 5. Anton would need to focus on these larger power blocks if his revolt was to succeed. For the sake of visual clarity, we'll distinguish those systems that declared for the Duke of Procyon on our star chart as a separate entity, but at no point did any claim independence from the Freeworlds League or shift between provinces. As well as the rebel capital New Delos, 5 other worlds were involved in planning the usurpation: Bernardo, Hazafelt, Ibstock, Ling, and Second Chance. All immediately went over to his cause. As the mightiest province, the Marik Commonwealth would naturally represent the core of Janosch's strength. Approximately 1/10 of all seats in Parliament were filled by their MPs. Although they were solidly behind their appointed ruler on the surface, conspirators lay within all branches of government. If the winds started to blow in Anton's favour, those turncoats would remove their superiors and swing the Commonwealth to his side. Captains General traditionally focused their attention on federal concerns, often leaving a trusted delegate to handle provincial matters. As of 3014, that was Shane Eastwick. He was a firm proponent of the Successor Lord, but also a pragmatist. If he could be turned, it would be a major coup for the rebels. Throughout most of the Free World League's existence, the Principality of Regulus had remained the nation's third power, but by the 31st century, its political ranking relative to its 2 main rivals had increased to the point where it nearly matched the Marik realm. Count Derek Cameron Jones was a vocal critic of the Captain General, particularly in relation to his handling of the 3002 offensive. Anton's companion, Willis Crawford, had been ruthlessly sentenced to death for his recklessness on Solaris, but Derek recognized that Janosch's own defeat at Lorik was no less embarrassing, and his decision to requisition all of his siblings' supplies to ensure he was not shown up did not sit well with the Count. Cameron Jones had seen in the moment how the Successor Lord's actions had painted his younger brother into a corner, and sympathized with the Duke. Anton was confident that Regulus would back him, but even unanimous support would not be enough on its own. The Grand Duchy of Oriente had waned in power since the days of House Allison, with many of its Corwood systems splitting off into smaller provinces. But as one of the founding members of the Free Worlds League, it still retained a great deal of importance. Like their predecessors, House Hallis maintains strong links to the Captain General. Christopher Hallis was still a firm supporter, but less so than the rest of his province. Anton could expect little help from this quarter, but perhaps could convince the Grand Duke not to get involved if he felt the conflict would present unnecessary risk to his own territory. The Duchy of Andurian was one of the biggest question marks going into 3014. There was perhaps no more vocal critic of Janosch Marik in Parliament than Dame Catherine Humphreys, but her verbal attacks were often directed as much at the wider Freeworlds League as they were the Captain General in particular. The Duke of Procyon had zero desire to offer her the independence she craved in exchange for support, but the threat that Andurian might join him in rebellion would hopefully be enough to prevent Oriente from committing their troops if it left their rear exposed. The merger of 5 smaller duchies into the Silverhawks coalition theoretically made them the 5th largest political player, with roughly 5% of the parliamentary vote when combined. But they were not a unified bloc, as rarely did their MPs agree on any matters other than their own defense. They leaned slightly towards Atreus, but the nature of their alliance meant they were unlikely to side with either Marik. The Stuart commonality was the Freeworlds League's former 5th power, but many of their systems had gone independent over the course of the succession wars. Earl Hector Stuart was Janosch's brother-in-law. Though his sister Anna had passed 3 years prior, he still had a good relationship with the Captain General. The Rim commonality was the most isolated of Regulus's former holdings, lying along the Periphery border. Frustration had been building within that region over the Captain General's apparent disinterest in reinforcing their garrisons against the growing pirate threat, namely the nascent Marian hegemony, who had raided their capital of Lesnovo only recently. The Abbey district had similar concerns about the Cercinus Federation, which lay at the terminus of the Marik-Steiner border. Their support was solidly behind Janosch, however. Along the Lyran Commonwealth edge of the Freewells League lay three smaller provinces. The Duchy of Tamarind was staunchly neutral, having never involved itself in the squabbling at Atreus. It was actually this region Janosch's daughter Therese Brett Marik had eloped to 8 years prior. Neither side could expect much in the way of support from them. The Syrian Concordance notionally had links to Anton through his position as Duke of Procyon, but he had never involved himself in the governance of this small corner of the League, nor made any effort to reclaim their long-lost capital. The neighbouring border protectorate exhibited far stronger loyalist sentiment. In the Freewells League interior, the Duchy of Graham Marik were ardent supporters of the Captain General, by virtue of their proximity to Atreus if nothing else. The province the rebel duke was most eager to secure was the Protectorate, not to be confused with the similarly named Border Protectorate. Support for Anton was stronger here than anywhere else, but the individual governors had not been trusted enough to involve them in the plot from the outset. Even still, he expected them to fall in line as soon as the Loyalist troops were removed from their territory. The support he was counting on here was offset by another close-by province. Lying rimward of the rebel heartlands was the Duchy of Orloff. Ruled by Janosch's longtime companion, Earl Vicente Orloff, there was perhaps no more fervent supporter of the successor lord than he. The Andurian splinter state, known as the Mozoro Archipelago, would most likely take its lead from House Humphreys. Though they were not crying out for independence in the same way, they were similarly isolationist. Anton was hoping for some support from the Regulan Free State. It was the son of their first speaker who had been spurned by Therese Marik when she rejected the marriage proposal her father had arranged back in 3008, to say nothing of their near-vassal state relationship with Regulus itself. The small Principality of Gibson was the more independent of the two Regulan breakaways, but had no strong love for House Marik in general. Far back in 2919, it was discovered that their government had been riddled with federal agents on the order of the two brothers' great-great-grandfather Samuel Marik. They viewed his descendants with near equal suspicion. The last two places worth noting are the Oran and Zion provinces. They controlled fewer than 5 seats each in Parliament, less than 1% of the vote. Both showed only surface-level loyalty to the Captain General. Ordinarily, they wouldn't have been factors in the Civil War, but their proximity to New Delos makes them worth remembering. Anton was optimistic that he could quickly win their support in the opening weeks, and then move on to bigger fish. The remaining 100-plus provinces were too minor and too varied in their allegiance to discuss, but the Duke of Procyon hoped that at least a quarter would declare for him once word spread. From the outset, the rebels understood that they only had a short window of opportunity in which to successfully usurp power, relying on speed to achieve their objectives. They had maybe 6 months to get the jump on their opponents, but the longer the conflict dragged on, the more time Janosch would have to marshal his superior numbers against them. Furthermore, there was only 12 months remaining on the Wolf's Dragoons contract. One way or another, the matter would be decided come May 3015. The Duke of Procyon needed a military if he was to accomplish anything. The foundation of Anton's army came from 4 Ducal Guard regiments, each an equal mix of battle mech, armor, and infantry battalions. These units had been raised in secret, training provided by the Capellan Confederation Armed Forces. The best among them were assigned to the 1st, and would serve as garrison on New Delos. The 2nd and 4th were of lesser experience, but no less fanatical. The 3rd was built around many small mercenary units on the rebel payroll, disreputable but disciplined. Among them was one individual of particular fame, the man known only as the Bounty Hunter. In addition to being one of the best MechWarriors in the Inner Sphere, he was also in possession of a suit of Nighthawk power armor, a priceless relic of the Star League Defense Force. Among the federal brigades of the Free Worlds League military, no regiment was more committed to the rebel cause than the Duke's own 3rd Marik militia, with whom he had spent most of his career. History was repeating itself here, as that same unit had aligned itself with Oliver Marik during the 28th century Civil War as well. Also involved in the plot from the get-go were the 18th, who had served under Anton for more than a decade. Within the rest of the brigade, both the 13th and 23rd had expressed dissatisfaction with the Captain General, but neither were at the point of rebellion yet. In contrast to the 3rd Marik militia, Janosch's first command, the 1st Atrian Hussars, felt little loyalty to their former colonel. This was perhaps indicative of how the FWLM in general leaned towards the younger sibling more so than the politicians did. Evidence suggests the Hussars were aware of the plot prior to the outbreak of hostilities. Several of their officers were in favour of joining. The Duke of Procyon could reliably count on their assistance if they could link up. The Atrian Dragoons were known for their fanaticism, but the captains and lieutenants of the 12th Regiment had a stronger allegiance to Anton. They were ready to overthrow their superiors as soon as their orders arrived. Among the Free Worlds Guards, the 2nd were almost at the point of mutiny, but were currently deployed along the Lyran border. It was unlikely that the rebels would be able to reach them unless the plan went faultlessly. The provincial brigades were another matter. Only 2 regiments of the Regulan Hussars were already assigned orders when Anton began the revolt, but he expected their 3 companions to follow suit. The 9th Regulan Hussars were actually away on an extended raiding mission into the Capellan Confederation when the Duke issued his proclamation. Exactly when they could be added to his forces depended on when they heard of the rebellion. Likewise, the entirety of the Syrian Lancers would probably join his cause as soon as word reached them in the Concordance. In total then, only 3 of the FWLM's 21 federal regiments and just 2 of the 36 provincial ones were ready to follow Anton's orders on May 22, 3014. Adding the 4 ducal guards still amounts to a rather paltry sum, but the Duke knew he had support among other units as well. Getting them to join him as he advanced towards Atreus would be essential. Command of the rebel army fell to none other than General Gerald Marik, second son of Janosch himself. His exact reason for betraying his father is sadly lost to history. Participating in the revolt moved him no closer to the Atrian throne than remaining loyal would have done, so it's unlikely that was his motivation. His decision is perhaps indicative of just how far the Captain General had fallen in the estimation of others. Gerald was the most martial-minded of the surviving heirs, matched only by his cousin Duncan, a young officer in the Marik militia. That said, his military record is unexemplary, perhaps suggesting that he was appointed to command by Anton for the political message having the successor lord's son on his side sent. The key to success in the coming conflict would be Wolf's Dragoons. 5 frontline regiments and several other specialist units made them a force to be reckoned with. Each mech regiment was organised more or less along the same lines. Alpha was commanded by Colonel Jamie Wolf himself, Beta by Jeremy Ellman, Gamma Wilhelmina Korst, Delta Sarah Weiss, and Epsilon Harold Jones. The Dragoons also fielded 4 other ground commands. Colonel Mary Terrell's Zeta Battalion was perhaps the heaviest concentration of assault mechs anywhere in the Inner Sphere, while the Fire Support Group, Special Recon Group, and Support Battalion carried out additional duties. The elite infantry of 7th Commando added further capabilities, while the Orbital Aerospace Operations Group provided cover for their mobile base and shipyard, Hephaestus Station. Together, they accounted for a full 50% of the rebel strength at the beginning of the revolt. Furthermore, this one mercenary group had a greater quantity of elite mech warriors than all of the Freewells League military combined. Their invincible reputation would also play havoc with the morale of those FWLM forces sent against them, making all the difference once fighting got underway. Crucially, Jamie Wolf retained independent command of his units. Officially, he was still contracted to the Capellan Confederation, and their agreement made no provision for his troops to be placed under Gerald Marik or any other of Anton's subordinates. Throughout the conflict, the Dragoon Executive Officer, Major Joshua Wolf, would remain on New Delos alongside a small attaché as liaison. All orders for the mercenaries would pass through him. When you look at the small list of units that declared for the Duke of Procyon at the outset, even if one generously includes those whose support he believed he could count on later, it can be difficult to see how Anton ever truly believed he had a chance at victory against the combined might of a successor state. Factoring in mercenary support, this still left them at a severe disadvantage. Those numbers tell only half the story, however. In the 31st century, transporting regiments by means of jumpship is a long, arduous process that can take many months. When the Captain General called for more forces to be sent to the Lyran front after the Steiner coup of 3007, the Duke leapt at the opportunity. Beginning in April the next year, Anton began to strategically clear the field of opposition. First up, the Steel Guards, a unit more loyal to Janos than himself, were dispatched from their station on McKenna to the far-distant Duchy of Tamarind. Around the same time, he began to denude his opponents of vital supplies, worsening their ability to resist him. Over the next 6 years, 2/3 of Oriente's battle mechs and 3/4 of Orloff's were gifted by the Duke of Procyon to other fronts, sometimes on the complete opposite side of the realm. His control over all FWLM jumpships within the Capellan Theatre meant it was fairly simple to leave any federal units that opposed him stranded until he was ready to deal with them. What little provincial forces were left would likely take up defensive positions, giving him a straight shot at his primary objectives. Janos would never get support from the defenders of Andurian, but neither would his brother. The Protectorate Guard would likely refuse to leave their home province undefended, but neither would they consider engaging in rebellion. The Silverhawk Irregulars would also remain on the fence. Anton almost wished they were used against him, as being ordered to fire on their fellow countrymen might be the push they needed to cross over into his camp. All 12 of Oriente's regiments, split evenly between the Fusiliers and Hussars, would likely oppose the Duke of Procyon, but they would hopefully remain on the defensive. His saving grace was that the most fanatical among them were all far away. It was a similar situation within the Orloff Grenadiers Brigade. The Stuart Dragoons were unshakably loyal to the Captain General, and the Marik Guards were absolute in their devotion to Janosch as well. Exploiting the Home Defense Act was also going to be vital in limiting how many troops the Loyalists could move against him. This piece of legislation, passed by his distant ancestor Elizabeth Marik back in 2906, allowed each region to withhold up to 75% of their forces to protect themselves, in the event that Parliament voted to declare their territory at risk of invasion, something which the MPs had routinely made use of over the last century. When Anton Marik made his proclamation on May 22, 3014, his officers immediately sprang into action. Over the next week, rebel troops set about cementing control of their region of space. His naval forces were tasked with securing as many jump ships as possible, a vital resource in the days ahead. The success of Anton's revolt hinged around the capture of two key systems, the federal capital of Atreus and the provincial capital of Marik. The Duke assigned a task force to achieve each of these goals, Eagle and Peregrine respectively. Taking Procyon itself, for both its modest industrial output and the political optics of controlling his own landhold, was a tertiary objective that would hopefully take care of itself. In addition to being a conspirator in the rebellion, Bernardo was one of the Freeworlds League's military-industrial hubs, making it a vital installation to hold on to. Capturing more of the League's weapon manufacturers was going to be essential to the rebel cause. A third task force, Falcon, focused on securing those factory worlds needed to maintain his forces, as well as eliminating any isolated combat commands that lay in a Corward direction. This would be the main priority for General Gerald Marik, Janosch's turncoat son. Assumption, Emrys IV, Keystone, and Oliver were secondary targets, but the big one was Irian. Anton's agents had been fomenting unrest on the planet for some time, and when word of the rebellion reached them, disgruntled workers seized control of the Soapstone Mountain mechworks, aided by special ops teams embedded within their number. It might not be possible to use those materials to support his effort, but denying Janosch those same facilities was just as important. The Aurum province had supported the Duke of Procyon in his fight against the Capellans, but his decision to go rogue did not sit well with them. It was a moot point, as the Regulan Hussars garrisoning the capital and neighbouring Vontebrunn seized control and set up a puppet government which declared for Anton, the first province to do so. From there, the 4th Regiment moved to assist the Atrian Dragoons in securing McKenna, but the most important objective fell to the 3rd Marik Militia, who seized control of the mech factories on Assumption. Word of the rebellion reached Atreus on May 24th, 2 days after the Duke's declaration. The delay can likely be attributed to ComStar interference. For the first 24 hours, the Captain General withdrew into his chambers and asked not to be disturbed. For a brief moment, it looked as if apathy would decide the contest before it even started. The next day, Janosch addressed Parliament on the crisis. Anton was dead to him. He would now take action to crush the revolt. As per Executive Order 1136, any who opposed him would be considered enemies of the state, their holdings seized, and subject to the Replevin Doctrine upon their defeat. This piece of legislation divided up the spoils between the other provinces, and had historically only been relevant after the conquest of some foreign territory. No one had foreseen how it could apply to internal disputes. This hardliner stance made it clear that a civil war was in effect. It could be argued that this decision worked against the Loyalists, since it guaranteed the rebels would fight to the bitter end. But crucially, it kept anyone sitting on the fence from committing to Anton's cause. Upon first hearing of the rebellion, Janos had immediately understood that reaching the Marik Commonwealth as quickly as possible would be his brother's main goal. During those first 24 hours of public silence, he was already working with League Central Coordination and Command on plans to defend his territory. SAFE provided him with a list of units whose loyalties were beyond question, and he would use these to construct a barrier just beyond the perimeter of his home province. In deciding which of the regiments of the Free Worlds League military to make use of in the coming battles, the Captain General had to consider a number of factors. First of all, he could not afford to leave his Corwood border undefended. A large percentage of his strength would be tied up holding the Lyrans at bay right off the bat. Secondly, the individual provinces were sure to declare a crisis and invoke the Home Defense Act, if they hadn't done already. Thirdly, although much of the FWLM was opposed to the idea of rebellion and would fight if attacked, few were so loyal that they would happily march to war against their own brethren. Therefore, Janos would need to play defensively while he repositioned his most zealous supporters to deal with the emerging crisis. Among the Marik Militia Brigade, the 1st and 15th were both safe bets, but the 6th were the real standout. Colonel Saj Rahal had been a trusted confidant and member of the Captain General's Council of Friends for the past 2 decades. To Janos's extreme good fortune, he was currently stationed on the industrial heart of the Protectorate, meaning Anton would need to go through him to reach the capital. The 2 remaining Atrian Dragoons were both fanatically loyal, as were the 1st Free Worlds Guards who were moved to the Marik system. These federal troops gave him a solid base of power, but he would need to draw on the provincial forces as well. From the Commonwealth, he could rely on the Marik Guard. From Oriente, the 1st Fusiliers Brigade and Hallis's own Ducal Guard. From Orloff, the 6th Grenadiers. And lastly, Stuart's blood ties would put both of the Earl's Dragoon regiments at his disposal. Plenty others would fight for him, but the LCCC cautioned the Captain General from doing anything that might erode that support at this crucial juncture, such as sending them to attack Free Worlds League territory. Mercenaries were another concern for both Marik brothers. Anton was already trying to talk some of them into breaking contract, but as long as the FWLM continued to pay them, that looked unlikely. However, the terms of their employment would not allow several of them to be used to suppress rebellion, limiting Janos's options. Before the end of the month, the Headhunters Mercenary Battalion began a long journey from their base in the Rim Commonalty towards the front line. The most urgent concern was Smithson's Chinese Bandits, whose existing deal had just expired. Quickly realizing the unexpected position her unit had found itself in, Colonel Erin Viola's price skyrocketed as the 2 factions made competing offers. No civil war exists in a vacuum, and Anton's revolt was no different. The other successor lords would follow events as they unfolded, but there were varying levels of interest among them. As previously noted, the Capellan Confederation had played an essential role in instigating the conflict, but now that it was underway, Maximilian Liao washed his hands of the ordeal and turned to focus his attention on the Federated Sons. The Duke was fine with this, as to be seen collaborating with the villainous Chancellor would do him no favours in winning the support of the people. Assurances that he would not stab Marik in the back was enough for him. The Lyran Commonwealth had made no such promises, however, and Anton was relying on them taking advantage of the situation to tie up much of his brother's forces along that front. The Draconis Combine was too heavily engaged along their rimward border to pay much attention. Only 7 months earlier, the first prince of the Federated Sons had been killed in action, and now his brother was seeking vengeance. This last successor state was more intimately involved than it first appeared, however. The Ministry of Information, Intelligence and Operations had thoroughly infiltrated the Duke of Procyon's staff and had been pushing him towards conflict for the past decade. Finally, there was ComStar. Vesser Christopher's mission was still ongoing. The rest of the organization just sat back to watch their plans unfold. With so many working against them, it's no surprise that conflict between the two Marik siblings was inevitable. Throughout the month of June, people across the Freewells League were asking themselves which side they were going to fall in with. Rarely was a planet's support for one faction absolute. Small uprisings erupted across cities nationwide. Beginning with the approximately 200 independent worlds, 21 publicly sided with the Duke of Procyon. Most notable of these was the province of Lafarge on Boang, a major trading hub situated between the Abbey district and the Principality of Gibson, but the others were relative backwaters, whose MPs would be drowned out in Parliament. The rest of the independents were split evenly between backing Janosch and remaining neutral. Support for Anton within the Protectorate was nearly unchallenged. He had served as their de facto ruler for the past decade, and they had benefited through his leadership. However, though he was popular among the citizens there, not all of those worlds were involved in the planning stages of his revolt. They were as surprised as the rest of the League at his pronouncement. The Zion province, like Oran, was more anti-Liao than pro-Marik, but the rebel seizure of Assumption led to outspoken criticism. Rather than remain neutral, they voiced their displeasure at the Duke's actions. Removing this threat to his rear became one of the early war aims of Anton's revolt. It came as no surprise when Grand Duke Christopher Hallis declared for Janosch early, nor when Earl Vicente Orloff followed suit. Anton's plan to counter this dangerous neighbour lay further rimward. He had hoped that the Duchy of Andurian would take his side, but Catherine Humphreys remained indifferent. The Duchess may have had a personal dislike for Janosch, but she cared little which of the two Mariks came out on top, understanding that neither would grant her province the independence they yearned for. The Mozero archipelago followed her lead, backing neither side in the conflict. Along the Lyran Commonwealth border, the provinces were similarly non-committal. The Border Protectorate wished to aid the Captain General, but the Protectorate Guard urged their government to stay out of the conflict for fear of a Lyran attack. Likewise, the Silverhawks coalition chose to remain neutral through invoking the Home Defense Act. The nobility of the Stuart commonality was tied to Janosch by blood, and had a comfortable enough buffer to back him openly, as did the Duchy of Graham Marik, which offered its jumpship fleet in support. The first real blow to Anton came when the Syrian Concordance failed to declare for him. Steiner saber rattling had them frightened, and they chose a neutral path by means of the Home Defense Act. He was also unsuccessful in securing backing from the more fringe provinces. The Abbey district had declared for Atreus as expected, but as a poor region could offer no practical support, while the Duchy of Tamarind remained steadfastly neutral. Some minor support existed in the Rim commonality, but nothing tangible. The big hit to his ambitions came when the Principality of Regulus decided not to declare for either party. This threw Anton's plans into disarray. His advisors had promised him firm support from the League's second power, and their abstention came as a shock. Though he enjoyed strong support within the provincial forces, as evidenced by the fact that they did not recall the 2 regiments that had sided with him, the politicians were not wholly convinced. Though they remained anti-János, this wasn't going to be enough for the coup to succeed. Finding the stick or carrot they needed to push them into his camp became the Duke's primary political objective. The other minor provinces aligned with House Cameron-Jones. Although the Principality of Gibson and Regulan Free States leaned towards rebellion, frustratingly, they too remained neutral at this time. How had Anton Marik misjudged the level of support he had so badly? The answer lay with the advisors and yes-men he was surrounded by. The Free Wells League intelligence agency, SAFE, remained steadfastly loyal to the Captain General, forcing the Duke to rely on outside help. Unfortunately, the Capellan Maskarovka and the Federated Sons MIIO operatives were only too happy to feed him misleading reports that exaggerated his popularity. His most trusted confidant, ComStar's Vesser Christopher, was worst of all. Every one of them was more interested in seeing the successor state tear itself apart than helping the revolt to succeed. The Second Marik Civil War began in earnest in June 3014. In the first 2 weeks, rebel forces moved to secure another 4 worlds, bringing half of the Protectorate and Zion province under their control. How willing they were to take Anton's side depended on the individual world. In some cases, he had made deals with government leaders ahead of time, whereas others saw the old guard swept aside by underground movements funded by the Duke. Elsewhere, his armed forces declared martial law to ensure compliance. Anton was banking on the neighbouring successor states to restrict how quickly János could redeploy to challenge him. His agreement with Chancellor Maximilian Liao would ensure he wouldn't need to worry about attacks to his rear, but the Lyran Commonwealth would not be as accommodating. Steiner looked to take advantage of the situation by launching raids on Megrez and Wing, the former attack only seen off after reinforcements from the Oriente Hussars were diverted to the planet while en route to the rebellion. Elsewhere, the headhunters continued moving towards Atreus. Believing that Maximilian Liao would not risk disrupting the civil war by choosing this moment to attack, the Captain General withdrew the 2nd Marik militia to the Commonwealth, while the Stuart Dragoons were redeployed to the provincial capital. János's mercenary negotiators folded to Erinviola's requests and agreed to pay the exorbitant fee Smithson's Chinese bandits were demanding. They too moved to bolster the defense of the planet Marik, bringing the total number of BattleMech regiments in garrison to 5. The first real battle of Anton's revolt took place in mid-June. Nova Roma was garrisoned by the hastily redeployed 9th Marik militia, backed by 2 armor and 4 planetary militia regiments. They had only just touched down ahead of the rebel advance. Leading Task Force Eagle in the assault would be the 3rd Ducal Guard and the 4th Regulan Hussars, supported by Wolf's Dragoons Beta Regiment alongside several of their auxiliary units. It was important to get the right optics from the get-go, so Colonel Elman would wait in orbit until called for so the population could see that it was their own people who had come to free them, not outsiders set on conquest. Both sides were hesitant to engage one another, with only light skirmishing on the first 2 days. But this served as a distraction for 7th Commando to infiltrate the capital city and take Governor Irene Constantine and her staff hostage. With no other option, she gave the orders for the defenders to lay down their arms, which almost all did. Colonel Montague Van Castle's 9th Marik militia managed to retreat off-world with only minor damage, regrouping on the adjacent Emrys 4. A few guerrillas required mopping up before the planet could be deemed secure. The bounty hunter would assist elements of Beta Regiment in rooting them out. Until this point, the battle had been almost completely bloodless, but a loyalist ambush along the Dawn River resulted in the destruction of some of the mercenary mechs. Never one to pass up an opportunity to get paid, the bounty hunter dispatched the attackers, but then instead of rendering assistance to the 2 surviving Dragoons, focused instead on salvaging the wreck of their officer's marauder for himself. The callousness of this action greatly angered Wolf's Dragoons. None took this more personally than the downed lieutenant whose command had been wiped out, Natasha Kerensky. With a first victory under his belt, Anton travelled to Nova Roma in person to make his next public address on June 25th, responding to his brother's parliamentary comments a month earlier. The Planetary Council were rounded up and paraded on stage alongside, forced to smile and agree with whatever rhetoric the rebel lord espoused. But the Duke had misread the room. His speech, which was broadcasted across the Freewells League and beyond, proved inflammatory. In it, he referred to his brother as a tyrant and expressed no remorse about starting a civil war, merely repeating his belief that Janosch was a weak ruler that needed to be removed. It was a major political blunder. Instead of shifting support to the rebels who had gotten off to a strong start, the fence-sitting provinces reaffirmed their neutrality. On the far side of the successor state, the Sackville system was experiencing a localized version of the Civil War. The planet had declared for Atreus, but the mining colonies on Sackville's moons were against them. By reconfiguring their mass accelerators, they were able to hurl gargantuan chunks of rock at the cities above. Even after burning through the atmosphere, they were still crashing to the ground with enormous destructive force. This campaign of terror continued for several weeks until the Loyalists were able to dispatch Marines to eliminate the renegades. July saw the rebels continue to expand their holdings in all directions, taking another 3 systems with little opposition. Others were redeploying ahead of future attacks. A loose collection of provincial forces that had flocked to Anton's banner were grouped together to form the 5th Ducal Guard. While Loyalist mercs were redeploying to key objectives within the Marik Commonwealth, FWLM regulars were launching their first counterattack against the rebel worlds of Acellus Borealis and Oceania. When the Stuart Dragoons arrived at the former, the planetary militia took up arms against them, hoping to hold out until reinforcements could reach them. The Lyrans, meanwhile, continued to exploit the situation by launching raids against Concord, Uhuru, and Sirios at the far end of the border. Crucially, this tied up more provincial forces that had declared for Janosch. 3 of the Oriente Hussar regiments were journeying back home, but the 3rd and 5th were both forced to divert along the border to assist the 31st Marik militia with fighting off the 9th Lyran regulars and Narhol's raiders. Anton's main objective that month was the capture of the military-industrial plants on Emrys 4. Task Force Eagle again took point, with Colonel Jamie Wolfe himself in command. Alpha, Beta, and Gamma regiments were dispatched to take the planet, alongside Zeta and the Fire Support Group. Opposing them were a pair of Marik militia units and a brigade of Federal infantry. Commanding the Loyalist forces was Janosch's close friend, Colonel Sarge Rahal. When the survivors from Nova Roma reached him, they informed the colonel on how the world had been turned so quickly. To prevent a repeat of that disaster, they placed the planetary governors in protective custody. To sweep aside hostile air cover, Anton lent a pair of aerospace fighter wings to Jamie Wolfe, along with FWLS Falcon's Nest, a rare Vengeance-class assault dropship, one of the most powerful vessels remaining anywhere in the inner sphere. These swiftly overwhelmed the garrison, clearing a path for the Dragoons. The Marik militia were entrenched at the industrial hubs. 2 weeks of bitter urban combat had made little progress. A breakthrough at the reinforced mech factory at Ivanograd was only possible thanks to a daring underground infiltration by Lieutenant Natasha Kirensky. She was one of only 4 survivors, alongside Colin McLaren, the other MechWarrior who had survived the ambush on Nova Roma. Unable to reinforce their compatriots at the capital, the 6th withdrew to their dropships. The 9th followed suit soon after. Able to blast through the aerospace blockade in August, the 2 units lived to fight another day. Though Anton had been able to secure another vital industrial hub, and had lost only a single planet to Janosch so far, the failure to eliminate any of the opposing mech regiments prevented the Duke from being able to celebrate. He understood that more were heading his way with each passing week. Worse, Dame Catherine Humphreys had unexpectedly taken a stand against him. The change of heart stemmed from increasing rumours that Anton was being backed by Chancellor Maximilian Liao, which he was. She may have been a vocal critic of the Captain General, but she hated the Confederation even more. The millions of M-bills in bribes the Duchess had received from New Delos were returned untouched. Andurian will accept no money tainted with the stink of Liao, was her blunt parliamentary statement on the matter. Though Humphreys invoked the Home Defence Act, one of her regiments was loaned to Janosch to guard against the Capellan threat. The remainder of that month saw the rebels take independent Lungdo and the capital of Zion, giving Anton another province, however reluctantly. The 4th Donegal Guards also struck at Nestor in late August, requiring the 5th Orloff Grenadiers to be sent in to force them off planet. Sophie's World was the final holdout within the Protectorate, a province which had already declared for the Duke of Procyon, but the Captain General concluded that the political gain of denying Anton that final system would outweigh the material loss that a battle there would incur. Defense of the planet fell to General Enrico Biggs, another Princefield Academy friend of Janosch. His task force consisted of the 1st Atrian Dragoons, the Mercenary Headhunters Battalion, 2 heavy armour regiments, another of infantry, and what was left of Colonel Sarge Rehal's command. Despite the sheer numbers, it was a fairly ragtag assortment that would have little cohesion on the battlefield. The attack on Matiran, Anton's first foray into the Grand Duchy of Oriente, was something of an afterthought. The rebel 12th Atrian Dragoons were sent to dispatch their loyalist compatriots in August. The 11th failed to prevent them from making a beachhead, and so instead chose to fight a war of maneuver in the dense forests. The chase dragged on into September. The 2nd Marik militia had arrived at the major factory world of Keystone, freeing up Smithson's Chinese bandits to move to the Grand Duchy's aid. Now it was the turn of the 12th Atrian Dragoons to dart through the jungle undergrowth, avoiding their pursuers. This was not the only reversal the Loyalists made in September. The Orloff Grenadiers began pulling back a pair of their regiments to reinforce Atreus, with the 8th stopping at Fardifolu to put down the uprising there. The 6th Oriente Hussars at last returned home after a long voyage, but the 5th were ordered back towards the Periphery, reaching Sierra the following month. A safe anti-terror team arrived on Ocellus Borealis to assist the Juggernaut Regiment in rooting out the last of the planetary militia that were fighting as guerrillas within the cities. In a final act of defiance, they turned to chemical warfare to inflict horrific casualties on the Stuart Dragoons. Janosch's hollow victory there was offset by the loss of Holt to Task Force Peregrine. Hurriedly raising the 6th Ducal Guards in September to free up the last of his assault force, Anton dispatched his reserve to deal with Sophie's World, Wolf's Dragoons, Delta and Epsilon regiments, with his fanatical 3rd Marik militia in support, temporarily reassigned from Task Force Falcon. Moving in tandem with the 18th Marik militia, headed towards Drusibakhen. Resistance there was almost non-existent, with the planet falling long before the contest on Sophie's World was concluded. General Enrico Biggs's plan was to play for time. It wasn't expected that any reinforcements would be sent, but other units would be moving to block the approaches to Atreus and Marik behind them. Though Wolf's Dragoons were the superior force, the fight dragged on. The Ducal Guard weren't the only brigade to add a new unit to their roster that month. After her remarkable performance on Emrys 4, Jamie Wolfe tasked Captain Natasha Kerensky with forming a new independent company from the dregs of Wolf's Dragoons. She and Colin McLaren would forge these reckless, undisciplined washouts into ruthless killers, and offer them one final chance at redemption. Natasha's unit was to be assigned the most impossible tasks, what other lesser MechWarriors might have deemed suicide missions. By all accounts, Kerensky revelled in this opportunity to be thrown into the thickest fighting. September 3014 proved a decisive moment in the war. The early advantage Anton had predicted had netted him a sizable chunk of the Free Worlds League, but the opposition was strengthening, and the rebels hadn't even entered the Marik Commonwealth yet. A trio of regiments had assembled on Drusibakhen in preparation for an assault on the factory world of Keystone, but it would be another month before that commenced. Problematically, none of the provinces whose support he had been counting on had declared for him. In Parliament, Janosch was able to use the crisis as justification to expand SAFE's powers, which assisted them in rooting out any rebel sympathizers, particularly those within the Marik Commonwealth, in exchange for greater government oversight after the fact. This all but assured that no other province would side with Anton unless his victory was already guaranteed. Continued neutrality was the best he could hope for. Most notably, the only other elite mercenary unit on par with Wolf's Dragoons, the 21st Centauri Lancers, had begun moving in his direction. Steiner, meanwhile, continued to harass the Free Worlds League. The Oriente Hussars on Uhuru were hit for a second time. Given the preponderance of Oriente and Orlov units along that front, it could easily be a coincidence, but it's possible that the Lyrans were observing which provinces have remained loyal, and were actively targeting those units as a means of exacerbating the situation. Later, they struck at the battle-scarred world of Bella 1, pulling back in October, only to hit 3 others later that month: Rochelle, Sheridan, and Wing. Fearing the increase in raids was a prelude to a larger invasion, Janosch was forced to maintain a strong garrison along the Commonwealth border. With the threat of Andurian no longer staying Christopher Hallis's hand, Anton hastily launched Operation Condor in October to bring a swift end to the 2 battles his forces were mired in, and then bring the fight to Oriente directly. Jamie Wolfe led his command to Sophie's World, landing in front of the retreating 1st Atrian Dragoons, trapping them between Alpha and the pursuing Delta Regiment. They were utterly destroyed in the battle. The surviving Loyalists fled to other key systems in the region, thus abandoning the Protectorate to Anton. Beta and Gamma, meanwhile, touched down on Matiran, with Captain Kerensky's independent company blocking the 11th Atrian Dragoons at a river crossing long enough for the main force to crash into their rear. Smithson's Chinese bandits had called off pursuit of the rebels as soon as they saw Wolf's Dragoons descending, retreating off-world after arriving too late to sweep Natasha's tiny force aside. The Atrian Dragoon survivors were imprisoned on New Delos, functionally removing the brigade from the Loyalist rolls. Operation Condor may have succeeded, but it took 3 elite regiments of Wolf's Dragoons to do so, meaning those troops were absent for the initial thrusts into the Marik Commonwealth later that month. Task Force Eagle took aim at New Olympia, home to the 2 most prestigious military academies within the Free Worlds League, the Allison MechWarrior Institute and the Lloyd Merrick Stanley Aerospace School. The unique political situation on that planet made this a promising target for Anton. The tiny Principality of Olympica was an independent continental province which had declared itself neutral in the fight. Elsewhere, support for Janosch was weak in the Karpov district, which surrendered to the invaders while they were still on approach, leaving only the military academies within the mountainous New Greenland districts to hold out. Altogether, Commandants Matthias and Lestrade could muster a battalion each of training mechs and dismounted mech warriors, with a squadron of aerospace providing cover. The cadets were able to offer a determined resistance within the mountain passes, making the rebel general Maya Freeberg pay dearly for each meter of ground she advanced. Though she was eventually able to secure the academies by the end of October, the arrival of the 21st Centauri Lancers would doom any chance of victory. Freeberg ordered her battered units to retreat off-world. Task Force Peregrine's assault on Abaddon was to be the final stop before the main thrust against the Marik Commonwealth's provincial capital. Dietrich's Devastators, the solitary mercenary company in garrison, were dispatched with ease. With the planet secure, Colonel Nathan Pierce ordered his supplies moved up in preparation for the fierce battle ahead. If they could succeed, it would turn the tide of Anton's revolt in favor of the rebels. Instead, the battle came to them. General Liao Gero Stewart led a pair of battalions of the Home Guard and an armor brigade on a spoiling action. The rebels were heavily dispersed across the planet when they made landfall, but almost every unit found itself encountering Loyalist troops, leading them to mistake the raid for a much larger counterattack. Fearing they were about to be overrun, Colonel Nathan Pierce ordered his units to retreat. They sustained only 2 companies' worth of casualties to the fighting on Abaddon, but the supply stockpile was a complete write-off. The loss of this strategic staging ground was perhaps the greatest defeat. Elsewhere, General Gerald Marik was leading Task Force Falcon personally, hunting the 15th Marik Militia on Berenson after the Rebel 3rd returned from Sophie's World. The Loyalists' poor supply situation gave them little chance of winning a stand-up fight, but they hoped to waste the general's time long enough for reinforcements to come, as they had done initially on Matiran. On the 11th day, a fleet of jumpships arrived in system carrying the 31st Marik Militia and 3 conventional regiments, with enough reserve dropships to transport the 15th to their next destination. Facing an imminent defeat, the Duke of Procyon gave the order for Gerald Marik to pull his forces back to Bernardo in November and set up defences there. Anton's failure to secure a foothold in the Marik Commonwealth was the point at which his revolt came undone. Though Delta and Epsilon would secure 2 more systems in November, Caenasan and Ocellus Australis respectively, this would mark the greatest extent of his territory. From this point on, his faction would be in decline. After multiple months in transit, the 2 Orlov Grenadier regiments arrived to reinforce Atreus, but in truth, the capital was already out of reach. Even the troublesome Principality of Regulus and their vassal Regulan Free State finally acknowledged Janos Marik as the rightful Captain General of the Free Worlds League. Perhaps sensing which way the winds were blowing, the Lyrans made only a single raid on Dieudonné that month. If the rebels needed an omen to realize how precarious their situation had become, it came with the unexpected appearance of the 72nd Heavy Fighter Wing at New Delos. This loyalist unit outweighed the rebel aerospace on planet, but made a tactical blunder by splitting their forces to strike at both Anton's headquarters and Hephaestus Station in orbit. This brought Wolf's Dragoons' Orbital Aerospace Operations Group into the fight, which quickly gained an advantage over the attackers, forcing them to retreat. Fearing for his safety, Anton raised the 7th and 8th Ducal Guards from whatever scraps he could muster. On Callaway 6, Loyalist forces were massing to deliver a knockout blow. Until this point, they had been defeated in detail by the numerically inferior rebels, but with 5 provincial regiments at their disposal, Anton would have to commit almost all of his military to challenge them. Unfortunately for the Duke, he was not aware of just how many battle mechs had been consolidated on Callaway. What was intended as a quick spoiling action would turn into a titanic scrap. The rebels were engaged the moment they detached from their transport jumpships, taking heavy casualties in the depths of space that would further disadvantage them in the coming ground battle. Their objective was to seize or destroy the Earthworks factory on planet. Leading that charge will be Wolf's Dragoons Beta and Gamma, with the 12th Atrian Dragoons and 3rd Ducal Guard in support. First to face their might were the 6th Defenders of Andurian. Unimpressed with being thrown to the wolves while the Oriente forces established a defensive line behind them, Lieutenant General Mildred Humphreys gave only token resistance before they moved aside to let them pass. At the Earthworks factory, another 2 regiments were waiting. Colonel Elman focused Wolf's Dragoons against the 6th Oriente Hussars, completely annihilating the unit. But before they could turn to face the Fusiliers, the other 2 Hussar regiments emerged behind them, splitting Wolf's Dragoons from their backup. When the defenders of Andurian came up from the rear, both rebel groups were now surrounded on all sides. All attempts to link up failed, and the last of the Atrian Dragoons were destroyed, as were the Ducal Guard. Beta and Gamma were only able to evacuate thanks to an incredible holding action by Captain Kerensky's company. The bounty hunter likely made good his own escape during the chaos. The defeat on Callaway cost Anton 2 regiments he could scarcely afford. Furthermore, Wolf's Dragoon's reputation for invincibility on the field had been shattered, even if the units had only sustained moderate damage. The final 2 Lyran raids of 3014 would end up being the last to take place during Anton's revolt, striking in December both the infamous Bella 1 and the industrial hub of Thermopylae. By exploiting the civil war, they had seized hundreds of tons of supplies and munitions over the course of the year, with very little in the way of losses. Going forwards, the LCAF refocused on preparing their own defences now that it was starting to look like the rebellion would soon end. Also coming to a conclusion was the long siege of the Soapstone Mountain mechworks on Irian. On the Captain General's express orders, negotiations with the occupiers were terminated, and the last of the holdouts were taken out by force, causing significant damage to the complex in their final moments of resistance. The rebels were in retreat along every front come December. The 21st Centauri Lancers hit Drusibakan just as the Duke of Procyon's forces were about to depart for their strike on Keystone, instead forcing them to pull back to safer territory. This freed up the headhunters to throw their strength behind the advancing Stuart Dragoons as they pursued rebel forces from Abaddon back to Holt. Colonel Nathan Pierce led his troops straight into a wall of heavy armour. Then, when they tried to withdraw, the Home Guard nipped at their heels all the way back to their dropships. Little more than a battalion of the Regulan Hussars made it off-world. As an aside, the 9th Regulan Hussars, who had been raiding the Capellan Confederation at the outbreak of hostilities, had elected not to return to the Freeballs League when word of Anton's revolt reached them. They had been hopping from system to system for the past year, avoiding confrontation until the matter was settled. Loyalist reinforcements continued to press forwards, with the 5th Orloff Grenadiers reaching the Stuart commonality, while their compatriots departed from Atreus heading for the front line. Their capital of Vanra was reinforced by the shattered 9th Marik militia on the Captain General's orders. He needed to make a show of trying to defend the Duchy of Orloff if he was going to hold most of their provincial brigade in reserve to protect Atreus. The 7th Ducal Guards were almost destroyed in their first engagement when Smithson's Chinese bandits landed on Fuentes, only spared from this fate by the timely arrival of Wolf's Dragoons' Epsilon Regiment. Outmatched, Colonel Erin Viola returned to Carbonis. Further spinward, Gerald Marik's task force was pursued to Bernardo. Unable to hold to the industrial centre against the loyalist Marik militia armada, he suffered another ignominious defeat, pulling back to Park Place. Hoping to regain some of the initiative, Anton ordered the remnants of Task Force Eagle to strike at Vanra within the Duchy of Orloff. 2 of the Marik militia regiments Eagle had clashed with earlier in the war had gone to ground there. They added their 4 remaining battalions to the 1st Orloff Grenadiers, 3 mechanized infantry regiments, and a combined arms battalion from Orloff Military Academy defending their school. Most of the force was arrayed along the cliffs surrounding the city of Sofia, with the Grenadiers posted around the government hall within. Alpha and Gamma regiments of Wolf's Dragoons arrived at a pirate point on January 5th, 3015, with the 4th Regulan Hussars in support. In a high-risk drop, they disembarked over Sofia's industrial estates, between the defensive line atop the bluffs and the city centre fortifications. With only a single battalion pinning the interior troops in place, the rest of the Dragoons crashed into the rear of the Marik militia. Despite a valiant effort by Colonels Rahal and Van Castle, victory for Jamie Wolfe looked certain. It was the resolve of the Regulan Hussars that broke first, however. When House Cameron Jones declared for Janosch 2 months earlier, they had excommunicated the 2 rebel units participating in the revolt. Perhaps hoping to join the winning side before it was too late, the Hussars opened fire on Gamma. Unfortunately for them, the Loyalists were too slow to realize what was happening. By the time they pushed out of their defensive position, Wolf's Dragoons had already wheeled and crushed the traitors in their midst. With the threat dealt with, Jamie Wolfe returned his attention to the Marik militia, catching the Loyalists in the open and crushing them. Seeing little hope of victory, the Orloff Grenadiers decided to abandon the world. They now looked to regroup with the rest of the brigade at Regulus. Elsewhere, the 21st Centauri Lancers were maneuvering to strike deep into rebel territory if needed. On the Corward front, the 23rd Marik Militia left the Stuart Commonality's Marik system and headed for the Marik Commonwealth capital 2 jumps away. Other militia regiments were also busy in the region. Leaving the 31st behind to secure the factories of Bernardo, the 15th pursued what was left of Task Force Falcon to Park Place in January. They were reinforced by the Home Guard and Headhunters, fresh off their own victory over Task Force Peregrine. The last of the rebel force was outnumbered and easily overcome. General Gerald Marik was taken captive. Frustrated by Derek Cameron Jones's decision to oppose him and by the betrayal of the 4th Regulan Hussars on Vanra, Anton launched a Hail Mary attack against Atreus via the Principality of Regulus, namely the Tiber system. Colonel Jeremy Ellman's Beta Regiment led the assault, supported by Zeta, the Fire Support Group, and Kiransky's Independent Company, as well as the Green 6th and 8th Ducal Guards. They landed wholly within the Regulan half of Tiber IV, ignoring the tiny Duchy of New Assam, the Free World League's smallest continental province. Initially, the invasion went well, with the conventional forces guarding the Earthworks Battlemech factory cleared with minimal effort. The Loyalist garrison had been able to send word of their plight to the provincial capital before being overrun, however, and a large relief force was promptly dispatched. First to make landfall were the lead unit of the Regulan Hussars. Despite being massively outnumbered, they were able to secure a beachhead long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Descending on their position, the entirety of Earl Vicente Orloff's provincial brigade touched down more or less simultaneously. The battle for Tiber split into 2 separate engagements. Wolf's Dragoons held the Earthworks factory against the 5th and 8th Orloff Grenadiers, along with the sole surviving battalion of Regulan Hussars, while the Ducal Guard fought with Vicente's 1st and 6th. It was this latter battle that started to go against the rebels first, but the Green troops continued to fight tenaciously against the Loyalists. Realizing that they could not hold against the combined might of 5 regiments once the provincial forces consolidated, Ellman sent a message to New Delos requesting urgent reinforcements. Unfortunately, Anton had nothing left to give them. Early in February, Wolf's Dragoons abandoned their position in order to prevent a disaster, hoping to reach their dropships before the Ducal Guard were completely overrun. Though they escaped intact, the rebels were not so fortunate. Nor for that matter were the Loyalists. 15 mech battalions had participated in the battle for Tiber. Only 8 had survived. Tiber was just one of many defeats the rebels would suffer in February. Asellus Australis was retaken, as was the industrious Assumption. Their manufacturing hub of Emrys IV was also raided by the Fusiliers of Oriente's 2nd Brigade, but the Delta and Epsilon regiments of Wolf's Dragoons were able to see them off without any notable damage being inflicted. Jamie's task force was recalled back to New Delos soon after, allowing the defenders of Andurian to reclaim Vanra later that month. The rebel position come late February 3015 was dire. Anton's revolt was crumbling around him. The situation got so desperate that he even wrote to Maximilian Liao to request that the Successor Lord dispatch the Capellan Confederation armed forces to assist him. The Chancellor correctly pointed out that foreign military aid would rob the Duke of the last of his support, but he also surely reasoned that the rebellion was a lost cause not worth getting dragged into at this stage. After all, the Freewells League had already been trashed over the past 10 months. What else mattered? Against this backdrop, Vesser Christopher made his move. One of his objectives had been to cause enough damage to Wolf's Dragoons that they would be forced to undertake another Periphery supply run, but so far, none of the mainline regiments had sustained more than a 25% hit to their combat effectiveness, delta less than 10%. Concocting a terrible plan to increase those casualty rates substantially, the Precentor planted the seed of doubt in his supposed master's mind that the mercenaries were planning to betray him. He suggested that they could prove their loyalty by agreeing to divide up their forces to replace losses among the regulars. On February 26th, Anton, Marik and Jamie Wolf came face to face to discuss the grave situation they found themselves in. Unsurprisingly, the rebel Duke was in a paranoid state, fearing that his sole remaining effective fighting force was preparing to abandon him. The evidence was plain to see, for the Dragoons were already busy disassembling Hephaestus Station into its modular components and preparing them for hyperspace travel. Hoping to hold on to some of their strength for himself, Anton requested that the mercenaries divide up their units as Vesser had suggested, but Jamie refused. Their contract stipulated that his warriors would not be placed under the command of any other rebel officer. Wolf instead proposed a new strategy. He would take his forces and strike at targets far beyond the front line, preventing Janosch from being able to consolidate his strength in one area. While the Dragoons have an almost flawless reputation, you don't need to be a cynic to see how they did not wish to be stuck fighting to the bitter end now that defeat seemed inevitable. Anton reluctantly agreed to the principle, but wanted the Dragoon XO, Joshua Wolf, to remain at Cienfuegos, along with a dozen other support personnel, which Jamie accepted. The colonel believed that the matter had been put to bed, but his actions had convinced the paranoid noble that Christopher was correct. Things began to happen very quickly from this point forward. The Captain General launched a major offensive, with Ibstock and Lungdo falling to the Loyalist mercs. Matiram was reclaimed by the Oriente Hussars, and Sophiesweld courtesy of the Orloff Grenadiers. Jamie Wolf, meanwhile, had dispatched orders to all of his regimental commanders for them to regroup at McKenna, but before they even entered the system, the two Loyalist regiments of the Regulan Hussars touched down on Weld. In a battle with their rebel counterparts, the 5th sustained 60% casualties at the hands of their countrymen. They withdrew to Fuentes, but just days later, the Dragoons inflicted similar losses on the victorious forces, reclaiming the world for the Duke of Procyon. No sooner had they driven off the Cameron Jones troops, the mercenaries received a communication from Anton. On March 6th, Joshua Wolf and the other staff officers left behind on New Delos were taken prisoner along with their families. Among the hostages were Jamie's wife Ellen and their 2 young daughters. Only the fact that his son Mackenzie was undergoing speech therapy within the Federated Sons at the time of betrayal spared him from the same fate. The rebel lords demanded that Wolf immediately place the Dragoons under the command of his officers, or else he would execute the captives. He had 2 weeks to comply. The colonel gave orders for Harold Jones to escort their dependents aboard Hephaestus Station to safer Second Chance, while he would lead the rest of their forces back to New Delos to confront the traitorous Duke. While the rebel faction turned on each other, the Loyalists were mopping up elsewhere. By the end of the month, Orenson and Sorunda had fallen to the Headhunters and 21st Centauri Lancers respectively. Now that Beta had abandoned Emrys IV, the Orlov Grenadiers saw an opportunity to seize the one major factory world still under Anton's control. The last surviving battalion of the 18th Marik militia were forced to retreat back to New Delos along with the dregs of the 5th Ducal Guard. What little remained of the 1st and 2nd Regulan Hussars teamed up with the 15th Marik militia to assault the 2nd Ducal Guard on Ling, but they too had been recalled to the capital in a hopeless effort to reinforce it ahead of the arrival of Wolf's Dragoons. On March 14th, 3015, Joshua was dragged before his captors. As insults were hurled back and forth, Jamie's brother was able to break free of the guard's grasp and seize his pistol. Before he could pull the trigger on the Duke of Procyon, Vesser Christopher drew his own firearm and shot Joshua dead. Too shocked by the turn of events to think clearly, the treacherous Presenter Rom was able to convince Anton to give the orders to execute the rest of the Dragoon captives, including Jamie Wolf's wife Ellen and their young daughters. When the Dragoons discovered what had happened to them, they launched an all-out assault on March 22nd. Opposing them were the full-strength 1st Ducal Guards, at most 3 battalions combined from the 2nd and 5th Ducal Guards, and 1 final battalion of survivors from the 18th Marik militia. The mercenaries had roughly double that. For 3 days, the last of the rebels made their stand at Anton's Cienfuegos headquarters. The fortified walls and heavy weapon emplacements were able to hold back even the might of Alpha and Gamma. Not everyone wished to fight and die for such a doomed cause. Elements of the 1st Ducal Guard fled to the starport, hoping to escape off-world, but were intercepted by Delta. To allow what little was left of his garrison to focus their fire in one direction, Anton ordered the surrounding woodlands torched to prevent any sort of flanking effort. But whereas others saw an impassable wall of fire, Captain Natasha Kerensky saw an opening. If her independent company could navigate through the inferno, they could breach the undefended rear wall unnoticed. Natasha had her own reasons for undertaking such a suicide mission, as she and Joshua had been lovers. Dropping into the heart of the conflagration, her unit waded through the flames to reach their objective, losing only 2 mechs to the scorching heat. Once inside, they laid waste to the generators, bringing down the perimeter guns, and thereby clearing the path for the rest of Wolf's Dragoons. Kerensky did not wait for backup. On March 30th, she drove her Warhammer into the command bunker's walls, coming face to face with the rebel Duke, before triggering an avalanche of concrete that buried Anton Marik alive. Alas, the death of their leader did not quite mark the end of the revolt. Janosch's declaration of war back at the start of the conflict made it clear what sort of fate awaited those who had rebelled, and so they fought to the bitter end. The Loyalist Forces spent the next 6 weeks mopping up the last holdouts. The final showdown at Fuentes began in April, when the 7th Ducal Guard and 5th Regulan Hussars faced off against the 15th Marik militia and Smithson's Chinese bandits. They held out for the rest of the month, during which time Gomija, Somonye and Vontobren were also liberated. The last rebel unit finally surrendered in early May, as did the few scattered planets yet to be recovered, thus bringing Anton's revolt to an end. A few weeks earlier, Janosch Marik himself had arrived on New Delos. Some anticipated a fiery showdown between the FWLM and Wolf's Dragoons, but this never took place. The treason trials began on April 16, 3015, even with the battle on Fuentes still ongoing, and ran for 6 months. The surviving rebel leaders were all condemned to death, as were a handful of planetary governors who had been forced at gunpoint to side with the Duke of Procyon. Most significant of those executed was the Captain General's son, Gerald Marik. Anton's revolt had devastated the Free Worlds League. All of the progress Janos had made at the beginning of his reign had been undone by a year of internal strife. The after effects are still being felt a decade later in the present-day 3025. At the beginning of the war, the nation had been a genuine rival to the other successor states, easily on a level with the Lyran Commonwealth, and streaks ahead of the Capellan Confederation. Just as House Liao had ended the Second Succession War as a second-rate great power, so too would House Marik end the Third Succession War as one. It seems unlikely that they will recover anytime soon. The Free Worlds League is still plagued by issues. On a macro scale, those planets who had fought for Anton, even reluctantly, are viewed with suspicion, as are the provinces who professed neutrality in the early months. On the micro end of things, individuals who expressed opinions one way or the other faced the same kind of distrust from their neighbours who desired a different outcome. The whole realm was left a dysfunctional mess. The military was similarly shattered. Almost all of the destroyed regiments were gradually rebuilt over the next decade, albeit with one notable exception. But the personnel of former rebel units faced those same misgivings, however unjustified that might be. The 3rd Marik Militia was not so lucky, stricken from the rolls and condemned to be forgotten. In an effort to plug some of the gaps, Janos Marik made a fairly magnanimous offer to Wolf's Dragoons, expressing his sympathies for the murder of their families on New Delos, and giving them a chance to rebuild as they garrisoned vulnerable border systems within the Free Worlds League. Jamie Wolf graciously accepted the 5-year contract. This created outrage, as the unit that was perceived as a Liao puppet, responsible for the deaths of so many, was seemingly being rewarded for killing so effectively. Shane Eastwick campaigned to have them either banished or executed. The reality was that the nation had been left extremely vulnerable to invasion in 3015 and desperately needed reinforcing. Ultimately, the political firestorm was calmed by other members of the ruling family. In Parliament, Janos's 4th child, Duggan Marik, an MP for the Marik Commonwealth and now second in line to the Atrian throne, mollified the politicians. Within the military, the Captain General's nephew, Duncan Marik, who had earned a fierce reputation for himself during the war fighting against those very same mercenaries, spoke strongly in their favour, expressing his admiration for their skill and honour on the battlefield. The question of who won Anton's revolt is fairly easy to answer. Everyone who participated in the fighting lost. But those who instigated the fight, save Anton himself, got exactly what they wanted out of it. Chancellor Maximilian Liao had dragged the Free Worlds League down to his level. He would not need to worry about any major attacks from that direction for years. The MWIO operatives feeding the former Duke false intelligence had managed to cause enough damage to the Marik family that they were no longer on par with Davion, Kurita, or Steiner, leaving only 3 credible successor states. ComStar had succeeded in devaluing the Eagle, strengthening their own sea bill in the process, but had also furthered their ideological aims by bringing ruin to more of the inner sphere. There was one objective ComStar failed to achieve, however, one that Vesser Christopher would be blamed for. Though Wolf's Dragoons had fought in many battles and suffered significant damage in the process, their superb talents meant that losses were not so extreme that they were completely incapable of continuing in the service of House Marik. The Precentorom's plan to force them to return to whatever deep periphery outpost they operated from in order to track them there had come up short. Disappointed with his performance, Primus Julian Tiepolo banished him to the unmarked Alpha Hydri system, some 200 light-years beyond the borders of the Inner Sphere, to die in seclusion. In many ways, Anton's revolt served as a harbinger for the end of the Third Succession War. It had been burning for a century and a half without any real progress or attempts at contrition, but all that was about to change. The Free Worlds League was utterly spent. The other successor states saw this as an omen that, win or lose, the conflict would soon be over. Only 10 more years remained. They just had to hang in there and survive to see the finish. How difficult could that be? Ahead of them lay the greatest shift in Inner Sphere politics since the formation of the Star League almost 500 years ago, and the most tremendous clash between battlemechs in the history of the Succession Wars. And that is the story of Anton's revolt. One of the real highlights of the Succession Wars, in my opinion. One I found incredibly interesting doing all the research for it, seeing how the events in the late 30th century, early 31st century kind of made it inevitable that there would be a clash between the two Marik brothers. How all those outside parties were pushing them towards war. A war that was going to be disastrous for the Free Worlds League, no matter who came out on top. And that's exactly what happened. This is definitely the lowest point in their nation's history since the ComStar War some 180 years before this. It was also far more destructive than the Star League era Marik Civil War of the 28th century. You sometimes actually see Anton's revolt referred to as the Second Marik Civil War in some sourcebooks. This is going to end up being the longest video in the BattleTech Lore History series since the Battle for Terra about 18 months ago or so, at the kind of conclusion of the Star League Civil War. I don't think we'll be seeing another one like this for a long time, but I really wanted to give this special focus, even if it is kind of just part of the much grander Third Succession War. I did try to write it as something that could serve as a standalone, something that could be shared around without any kind of prior knowledge of the, 30 hours or so of BattleTech Lore History that's come before it. I made sure to reiterate some of the things that long-time viewers will be more familiar with in terms of the political structure of the Free Worlds League. I also wanted to really stress the difference between what Anton Marik thought was going to happen before the first shot was fired, and then what actually happened after the fact. If you just look at the raw numbers, you can only conclude that Anton Marik was totally mad to even attempt to do what he did, because clearly from the start, he had no hope of victory. But there was so much disinformation going around his camp, all the foreign agents working against him, that he was misled into launching this doomed rebellion. And yet, even still, with the help of Wolf's Dragoons, for a time, he was doing quite well. Or at least he was doing about as well as he possibly could have. The sourcebooks all tend to point towards his inflammatory speech on Nova Roma as that one fatal mistake where it all went wrong. But quite frankly, I don't think there's anything he could have done that would have ended in success for him. It was doomed from the very beginning. I wish we had some quotes from that speech I could have put on screen, but I couldn't find any anywhere. We're simply told that he showed no remorse about starting a war and called his brother a tyrant. Make of that what you will. We've got 2 more chapters left in the Third Succession War series, I believe anyway. The next one is going to cover a lot of things, basically the final decade of the war. Special focus on Operation Doppelganger, and that's going to take us up to 3025. I want to cover most of events in 3025 as well, but the 10th and final part in the series, where I think is going to be the 10th episode, it depends how long the 9th one gets, I might need to split it in 2. But yeah, anyway, the finale is going to be focused exclusively on the battle for Galtor. Since that is the largest concentration of battle mechs at any point in the first, second or third succession wars, and since I so rarely focus on the specifics of ground campaigns, for the most part Lore and History is kind of a high-level overview, I thought I would use that knowledge that we have about Galtor to make it its own special thing, our finale for the series. Anyway, this episode was long enough without me rambling on for another 10 minutes at the end, so let's wrap this up. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this special episode we had today. If you did, you can leave me a comment below, or if you've got any questions, feel free to ask them. I'll try to respond to as many people as I can, as I always do. You can help the video reach a wider audience if you give it a like, or indeed share it around with any other BattleTech fans who you think might be interested. And if you don't want to miss the third Succession War finale, you can subscribe to the channel too. If you want to support me further, there is a Patreon link in the description as well. And one more final thing just before I say goodbye for good here. This video was never supposed to take quite as long as it did to get out. But since it has, I notice it's going to more or less align with this channel hitting 25,000 subscribers. I want to thank everybody for their generous support and encouragement that you've given me over the years, without which I never would have made it this far. So thank you, sincerely, it means a tremendous amount to me. Cheers for watching folks, and I'll hope you join me again soon for another video.